So our second article comes from CBC News Canada and was published on October 30th, 2022 by Josh Grant. The article tells us that census data has shown that British Columbia is the most secular province in Canada. This comes from Statistics Canada that carries out a census every 10 years and asks Canadians whether they belong to a religious organisation or group. We get balanced viewpoints in this article from the likes of Ian Bushfield, Executive Director of British Columbia Humanist Association, Reverend Carmen Lansdowne, the moderator of the United Church of Canada, and Father Douglas Fenton, Executive Archdeacon of the Anglican Diocese of New Westminster. I've got a feeling that I'm going to disagree with some of you on this. So I'm going to pass it on over to Kelley so he can kick us off.
Okay. First off, I love it when you get good news to report, right? That's the and then there's a quote in the article from I was expecting Cynthia to go first, and she had the guy's full name, but his last name was Bushfield, and it kind of just jumped out to me. It was, BC has always been a bit of a different place. Now, I'm older, and I think people my age realize that it was a bit different when Cheech and Chong came from there. So, but over 52% of the people, that's freaking awesome. And it goes to show that in battles of critical thinking, we can win. And I just feel so awesome about this. I do think that a lot of it is generational. I stopped believing after my parents were divorced when I was in my early teens, and my mother stopped forcing me to go to church on Sunday after that. But I have 2 kids, and even though I educated them, I discussed lots of different religions with them, I exposed them to religion. We even went to different churches because I didn't want them to just follow in my footsteps because, right? And they both turned out to be atheists. So if each generation does that, I just, by doing that, I increased the atheists in my household by 150%, right? So just doing that is winning the battle for us, I think. And it's Ian Bushfield. Thank you, Cynthia. But I'd like to hear what Jason has to say about it.
Well, what really stood out to me, or stands out to me, are the responses that the Father Douglas Fenton gave. He was the executive archdeacon of the Anglican Diocese in New Westminster. He gave, it seemed like he was kind of dancing around it. What did he say? He says, when we talk about who's religious and who's not, we are often measuring attendance at a place, a church or a mosque or a temple. He went on to say, and not talking about the relationship that faith plays with an individual's life. I feel like that it's kind of a smokescreen and a way to play with the data to confirm his biases, because he goes on stating faith communities in BC are still very engaged in important issues like housing, homelessness, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and climate change, while offering important services such as shelters and food banks. The church's role here is no less diminished than it is anywhere else. And that's why I think those numbers sometimes play a different role than they should. To me, it just seems like he's trying to alleviate his dissonance. That's, and that's what really stands out. It's like he's seeing, like what Kelley was saying, there's skepticism, criticism, reasonable thought is starting to purge people of at least that like adherence. And what really stood out to me is that as that Christian dominance is starting to wane, we're starting to see other religions get a little bit of a foothold. You don't have people so nervous being Islamic. You don't have so many people nervous about getting any type of Christian backlash. Now, I live in Texas, so, it's probably a little different than British Columbia. With our elections and everything, were very interesting this year. So British Columbia has a little more rights than we have out here when it comes to certain things. So I would understand that it's probably easier for them maybe to make this shift. But I think it's a positive thing. I'm really interested in what Cynthia has to say about this. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but if you would, please tell me how you feel.
Certainly, I will. First off, Texas is its own thing. Being in Texas,
I'm sorry.
No, it's one thing, like we had so many different shows where we talked about Texas in of itself, especially like with some of the legislation that came down specifically that was from Texas. And being there is a whole different thing. My goodness, Texas is like its own patriotism in its state, to the point where it looks like that the inhabitants of itself looks at itself as they are their own country.
Oh, of
Which is,
course.
yes, it's so interesting. I'm proud, instead of saying like I'm proud to be an American, I'm proud to
Yeah.
be a Texan.
Oh yeah. Why
You
would you
know,
be proud to be an American?
no,
If you're a
you
Texan.
can't. Right, if you can't be proud to be an American unless you're a Texan. I mean, I felt so pressured. I had to buy a 10-gallon hat. I bought 2. But regardless of that, what were we talking about? Oh, yeah, British Columbia. Great. So I think it's like, pretty interesting, like, especially since like a lot of our ACA hosts are like coming from Canada right now, especially from BC. So like, shout out to y'all. But one of the things that I kind of like remarked when I was reading the articles about this particular research is that it's pretty much on trend of some of the things that we were discussing in past shows. So like specifically in the United States, we are sitting, according to Pew Research, at 29% in 2021 of people who would consider themselves irreligious or non-religious. Okay. Which is the largest trending group that is actually becoming larger and larger year after year. So it makes sense to me that especially like, and I was actually having this conversation with a friend of mine when we were talking about like Texas has its own particular values of patriotism according to their state. Canada has their values as a country of itself. And some of the different things that they have communicated to their constituents is that Canada is fairly nice. Canada is a place where we're kind of like, kind to one another. Canada is, we don't necessarily want to step on each other's toes. And in some cases, Canada also espouses that they have like a larger scale of skepticism, maybe than, some of the rest of the Americas, which, sure, let's go with that. But, so when I was just thinking about that, along with Canada's, perceived values or propagated values, I can definitely see like this region actually becoming more and more secular per se, especially like when you're talking about, I think that the article like mentioned, according to the 2021 population census, 34% of people in Canada claim to be non-religious. While in BC, that number jumped to 52.4%, as Kelley mentioned, the highest it's ever been. And so I was even thinking about like when we even reported in past shows about how people who are saying that they don't believe in God in America alone has like jumped from 11% in a 10-year space to like now like 81% are theists rather than like over 91%, right?
Yeah.
So I think that as we are going along, and especially like as we are as a human race, like, encompassing the human race, are learning more about how our environment works, and especially how things are pointing towards a nature explanation versus a supernatural explanation. It kind of, dials us back to actually saying that, oh, it must be God. Especially like every time that we actually got more information about something, we found out, yeah, it wasn't God. Yeah, it wasn't God.
Of course.
But Richard, I'm curious to know. I don't know if you actually got a chance. What did you think about some of the things that the perspective of Dr. Carmen Landon said, who is the moderator for the United Church? I was wondering if you have a perspective on that.
I think it was interesting in all from all the aspects. I think it was a fairly balanced article in that it gave different people a voice to speak with. I'm not sure I've got an opinion, particularly in what she said from her perspective. My concern with the article, I had two concerns with this article. The first one was that it didn't make clear what secularism was. From the outset, it said both it refers to secularism as both without religious affiliation and the view that you can still be secular and hold on to your religious belief, which is what Carmen was saying. And it didn't give a clear distinction on what secularism was, and that confused me from the beginning of the article. But I think, and I don't know whether this is my geographical location, and I think this is where I might disagree with all three of you quite a bit, is that from purely the aspect of coming out of religion, I don't think that's necessarily something on its own to be celebrated. And that's because where I'm from, although we have an intertwined state and religion, not many people are actually religious. But what we do have is huge amounts of lack of skepticism, lack of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Virtually everybody I know believes in ghosts. I don't think I know a single person in Britain who doesn't believe in some form of something. That's I don't believe in God, but I do believe that there's something. And just coming out of religion in and of itself does not automatically mean that we've got a skeptical society and a society which is critical thinking. And I think when I see articles, every time I see this discussed on the non-profits, that's something that jumps out of me. The celebration of this seems to ignore that aspect of it. And I think that's something that's really, really important for us to acknowledge. I'm not saying it's a bad thing by any means that people are becoming more secular. It's a good thing. That's not my viewpoint. But I think we shouldn't celebrate prematurely that just because somebody is coming out of religion, that's going to solve all of the world's problems. Yeah. Kelley?
There is a companion article to this segment, and I found that to be really, really, really heartening. But first, before I go into that, I think you're right, Richard. And the population that Cynthia mentioned earlier, the nuns, the NONESs, that are on the rise in the USA, when they do that poll, the nuns are people who are not affiliated with the church or religion. Right. And there's a lot of people who would say, well, I believe in God, but I don't ever go to church. Right. Mm-hmm. And they would fall into that category. So when we say there's 29 or 36% of nuns in the United States, I don't know that those are actually all people who don't believe in the Christian God even.
Oh, no, they're not.
Right.
They're not.
Right.
They're
and
not.
I am always hesitant to think that we're winning that quickly, although we are winning. We're definitely winning. Mm-hmm. And this report in the second article mentions that they went through 4 different models, but through all the different models, that somewhere between the year 2050 and the year 2070, that the nuns will outnumber Christians in the United States.
Right.
And with that growing population also comes growing political power. Mm-hmm. So don't eat the good little atheist babies, right? Just leave those ones alone.
Right.
But that should give a lot of the people who are watching hope for the future, because this is well within your lifespans, right? And when you're an old person like I am now, you'll be able to control politics and actually make the changes that need to be made, instead of like doing what my generation has done and not making those changes.
Yeah.
So I really find that whole article really enlightening. Jason, you have something, or Cynthia, you have something else you wanted to say?
Well, I wanted to comment specifically about Richard making that whole statement about like still running into people in Britain that believe in ghosts. I mean, Britain is old as fuck. Come on, Richard. I mean, like, and it's so much fucking lore that is like attached to the fucking country. I mean, London alone is this foggy. You just think this walking around, all the foggy, it must contain not only evaporation or gases like, water that actually comes up because, like, it's on the ocean, but shit, maybe there's ghosts just like hovering around here. I mean, like every 2 seconds, like Tower of London, old, the Westminster, old, this
let me just point
Stewart,
out before you
old.
continue. Let me just point out before you continue that Britain is so old that we had Christians in Britain before the Bible was finished being written. That's how
amazing.
old we are.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just old as fuck. So like you can't necessarily, like escape any type of country in some type of ghost lore when you are old as fuck. Okay, come on, y'all. Don't you all still use like Roman built roads for Pete's sake? I mean, come on now.
This is true. This is true.
Okay, all right, cool. But when I was asking you specifically about Dr. Carmen Lastdown, who's the moderator for the United Church, she is actually the first female Indigenous leader of the religious denomination in Canada, and she was mentioning, and I believe that we also talked about this in previous shows. A rising of people who happen to be irreligious and even going to agnosticism and atheism because of a lot of the scandals that happen in church. I mean, like if we're talking specifically about British Columbia and Canada, this is the hotbed of residential schools, and finding like thousands of graves of buried children that have been murdered, at the behest of the Catholic Church that actually had these residential schools specifically for the Indigenous community that was there. You're right. And it wasn't just in Canada that we had this issue. In the United States, they have also found they also have ran residential schools by the Catholic Church that had the same problem. It just was more prevalent in Canada, right? So we had that issue. And then also because of all the scandals, the sexual abuse scandals too, that have happened at the behest of not just the Catholic Church. We even covered the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yep.
And some other, and we even talked about like some other denominations of churches that have also did cover-ups when it comes to their bad behavior towards their but towards their parishioners. So I definitely would say that can be a contributing factor, like people who are just completely disenchanted with the church, saying that, hey, if God cannot keep a bit on your genitalia when it comes to abusing kids, then why the fuck would I actually worship him? So we're going to go ahead and like to scale back, like, you know what, I'm good. And I think that's definitely a contributing factor. But I think I don't necessarily just want to say that's the only thing, right? I think there's a lot of different things that are definitely happening, especially like when you're talking about Christian nationalism that's rising. Specifically, and I heard like one person calling Christian nationalism the religion of white supremacy, where like it's not necessarily about bringing a change that will be good for human beings. This is basically just a way for us to garner power because God said, right? And this is completely made up in their particular heads, and they actually use this as like a as a point for them to be able to move politically and socially and economically, right? And then of course all the other ills that have come with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of the church operating globally that has actually like harmed people. And then of course, like, gaining knowledge about how nature in of itself works, not necessarily pointing to any type of supernatural deity to say that this actually is a thing. So I mean, like, we have all these particular variables that are contributing to this, but I think that there is still some point of our own evolutionary wiring as human beings that actually leans to, if we don't necessarily have an explanation of the universe or something that hasn't been completely revealed in science, etc., we have a tendency to imbue the supernatural in it.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with you, and I think there's one thing I wanted to hit upon that you brought up, and then I want to hit on something that Richard said.
Mhm.
The first thing is something you brought up about the reason people leave church and identify as atheist and agnostic, and that's always difficult for me because I can understand leaving a church because an organization is just fucking terrible, but not believing because people were shitty, like to me that doesn't seem like a reason to disbelieve. Like
Mm.
people can still be shitty, but I like what Richard was saying. I kind of see what he's saying. Like I don't want to be part of this, but that doesn't mean I still don't believe, right?
It's a
And if
reason to leave church, but not a reason to leave actual belief.
faith, yeah, not a
Yeah.
reason to leave faith.
Right.
Now, and to what Richard said is like I'm it's hard for me to get excited about people just leaving that. Well, my bias being here in Texas is that if somebody leaves church, there's a lot connected to that. Like if somebody's no longer working in their church community, that means they've lost friends, they've probably lost work, they've lost a social network, and they're kind of starting from scratch. So I get extra fucking excited whenever I hear somebody's like, yeah, I'm not into that anymore. You know, okay, cool, you're not into that anymore. Cool, get out of that shit. Come hang out with us. It's a lot safer, and nobody's gonna try to shoot you while you're standing in your yard. So I get excited due to my bias, and I think it's really good if you're part of a church community and it's really fucking you over and done some horrendous shit. That's a good reason to leave, but I still don't think that's a good reason to call yourself an atheist. You still
Yeah.
need to go a little deeper before you consider yourself an atheist, because if you're convinced on the grounds of other people doing things, then you're going to be convinced pretty easily back towards the other direction, because that's
Right.
not a really good reason to disbelieve. That's just my opinion. People could disagree with me, but that's how I feel. Okay. If I could, I'll just pass it to Kelley. I know Kelley wants to say something really quick, but thank you all.
I just wanted to point out that this is in British Columbia, and we do have some friends of the nonprofits in that area. Neil, the 604 Atheist, Nate Smith, Randolph Richardson, and I like to think that maybe that they helped get those numbers up too. So shout out to them. That's all.
Definitely.